Hello, friend, and welcome to another episode of the Bonsai Pot-cast by Blue Nose Trading. I'm your host, Tori Solis, and today I'm going to be talking with Chris of Red Mountain Bonsai. Today I chatted with Chris about his experience wood firing, selling his work, and tending to his trees. We had some audio quality issues with the recording on this episode, but it was still a great chat. So without further noise, let's dive into our conversation. How are you today, Chris?
Good, how are you?
Doing great. So you have a really cool business name and logo. How did you come up with that, Red Mountain Bonsai, and what are the characters on the logo?
I grew up on Red Mountain Avenue, the town that I grew up.
Okay,
That
cool.
was it. And the symbols just mean Red Mountain, or at least I hope they.
Nice. Whereabouts is Red Mountain in southern New England?
I'm in Northwest Connecticut.
Okay, so Connecticut. Nice. I've never been over that way, but I heard it's beautiful.
Yeah, it's nice. It's nice. It's super hot this week, but it's just nice.
Well, I hope you guys get your fall soon. I bet it's wonderful up there. Your leaves actually change colors.
They do.
Everything just gets hot here until it gives up. It goes into an early summer dormancy and everyone just gives up until spring. So, Chris, tell me, how did you get started in clay?
So in 2008, I took my first real bonsai classes. I've always been plants and pots, and we worked at a nursery as a teacher, but I took a couple lessons in 2008. I met more people through the Greater Hartford Bonsai Society, and then I started taking more workshops with Nick Lenz over the course of 10 years, seeing his pots, seeing his garden. I became immediately more focused on pottery. So my pot collection is massive compared to my collection. In 2008, I also was taking growing lessons with a local woman. Everything was fired in an electric kiln. Some of the stuff came out pretty cool, but when I started seeing what was being produced out of wood-fired kilns, I was much more interested. But fast forward, 15 years, I met a guy that pretty much lives around the corner from me that makes awesome non-bond pots. That's where I kind of gravitated towards, was the real rustic, wonky, uneven non-bond pots. So I used to buy a lot of pots from Dremel. Make really great bond pots. But the local guy that I met, Brandon Stolickney, fires at Clay Works as well. I wasn't really thinking about getting back into making pots, but then I just noticed how much more I had. I approached the owner, Tim. Bought some space in I think it was last June, the Boragama firing. Didn't really think it was going to be to get into it on a monthly basis. That could always sell out, or there wasn't room. Started not really working there last September, but I spent a couple days there helping out.
So you got started in the nursery and the tree side before you started into the ceramics then?
Yeah. So like in 2008, I got tree side again, really like the non-bond shape.
What would you say makes a good non-bond?
I like when they're a little more thick. Like, I don't like the delicate ones. I like when they're really so I want a good a wave in the lip of the pot, or a little bit of a wobble in general. Warpage in general with the wood firing kind of too. So when I put something, it always seems to warp a little more when it comes out. And sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. Usually it's good on the lip side of it, but sometimes the foot gets a little more, or the base gets a little more warped. So you'll have to address that with any kind of wobble, So sometimes there'll be a bloating in the base that you'll have to address afterwards.
Also really love the non-bond style pots, but I find that mine come, they come honest. If I get one, I'm just like, oh, well, there it is. But with electric firing, there's a lot less, variability. Like you said, with the wood firing, sometimes you don't know when or how you're going to wobble.
Yeah, so I have a couple non-bonds from like 2000 that I made that were fired in electric. The color of the clay is completely uniform. Amazing how boring they look compared to what comes out of the
wood fire. What kind of wood kiln are you using? Like, I know there's a few different kinds. I'm not really familiar with all of them, so just enlighten me on yours and how it works.
Well, so again, and you're talking to a huge novice here. I'm
I gotcha.
always talking to everybody at the studio and asking them to explain things, and it's almost like what's the? I always need to be told like what really reductive firing is, because I could kind of explain it, but I always told like can you explain this to me again?
I
So
gotcha.
there's a Noborigama. There's a two-chamber Noborigama, which is more of a
Okay.
glaze kiln, and it's
Mm-hmm.
sloping shape, almost like a dragon, where it has the chambers connected, but they almost have like a flow to them.
So, does your studio fire as a group, like where y'all take shifts, or is it just someone's manning that whole ship?
It's done by shift, 4 or 8 hour shift. With two people, sometimes three, with like a more of like a supervisory person.
I gotcha. What shift do you like to take, if you could take any of them?
During the day is better. I've done a lot of overnight shifts. It seemed like when I first started firing, those were the shifts that weren't filling. So I would jump into those. Working overnights can be it's a lot more quiet and it's usually cooler, but it's still exhausting to be out at 2, 3, 4 in the morning and then watch the sun come up. So it has its positives, but for the most part, firing during the day, I do it 12 to 4.
Yeah, I thought about. I look at the. I haven't got to do a wood fire yet, but I know I've heard about the shifts and the overnight. I was like, oh man, I hope I wouldn't end up with that one because I'm a morning bird, not a night owl, and that is way past my bedtime. I just don't know if I could physically do it.
It's not easy, but it's not the worst. Again, it's you. I'm so excited to be there and knowing that in a week it'll be like Christmas. So um, it's not terrible, but the 8 hour shifts, again, sometimes it's tough where you're literally taking wheelbarrow loads of wood back and forth all night long. So it's not like sitting there hanging out. It's hard work.
Oh yeah, it's hard work for sure, for sure, for sure. So are you? What's your process for your building and your construction? Are you a wheel throwing? Are you hand building? You do a little both?
Everything's coils now. I have a wheel and I have a kick wheel in the basement that I just haven't started using really.
Have you ever thrown before?
Yes, again, but it was like
Okay,
15 years ago. Um,
I
so
gotcha. I gotcha.
definitely rusty. My basement doesn't really have a sink, so I didn't really want to be down there just working out a bucket,
Yeah, that
clean
makes
up.
sense.
I can studio whenever I want, but again, it's like a time issue where I don't really have a lot of time. So if I'm working there, I don't have time to sit there and throw. So when I come home, whenever I have free time, I'm downstairs building. I'll just I'll roll out the base, I'll roll out the coils, and just go from there
Oh, that's awesome. Do you have a slab roller, or are you rolling out
by
slabs by hand?
by hand.
Bless you.
I'm not really making
That's
it
a lot.
larger than like a 10-inch base, so it's not terrible.
Okay. All right. I guess that's a little bit better. People ask me for ovals, and I'm just like, I don't have a slab roller. Oh, lab rolling slabs is hard. Working with slabs is tough work for sure. It does. It makes everything tired. It makes my back hurt. So, are you using any glazes, or are you letting the ash glaze your pots, or?
Yeah, so with my bonsai pots, it's all just atmospheric wood ash. On my orbs and some of my smaller bowl-like accent pots, I am using usually a nuka, a white nuka, or a white Shino glaze. Whatever I fire, so when we fire in the train kiln, I don't usually put anything in there with any glaze whatsoever. It's when I fire in the Noborigama that I'll glaze. The Noborigama usually has my smaller pots, so my accent pots and my orbs will go in the Noborigama. But yeah, usually everything that goes into the train kiln will be just unglazed raw clay.
So, what clay body are you using? And how did you choose your clay body? And how does that clay body influence the work that you're making?
So Tim at Clayworks has Tim's mix. Tim is the individual that owns the studio. It's a two-part stoneware that's mixed with chicken grit, like granite chips. There's also sawdust and silica sand. So it's a pretty groggy, textured clay. I just used that because they told me to. So I didn't really have a lot of, knowledge or know.
Yeah, it's just good for the kiln.
For a cone 10 hand building clay, it's great.
Are you guys just going to cone 10 or do they go past cone 10?
Yeah, they go past. They don't hold it past for very long. And again, these are all like technical things that are above and beyond my pay grade. But
No worries.
we roughly fire to like 2450.
Okay.
And again, it's not necessarily held there a long time.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's hard to get it that hot, I'm sure, and then to hold it there takes, a lot of wood too.
Right, right. We have Sheffield Pottery is also pretty close to me. It's about an hour away.
Oh, I've heard of them.
Yeah, right up in Sheffield, Mass. And I've been using their architectural buff cone clay as well. There's a ton, very, very gritty and groggy.
Do you like the grittier clays with the grog? Have you ever worked with like a softer, like stoneware or porcelaneous even?
So not anything porcelain. Some of the clays that I have used that I'll use for more with molds, you can tell they just don't have any. There's nothing in the body that helps them stand. Where the groggier, it just seems that when you're building vertically, it doesn't want to collapse at all. Where the naked clays will seem to want to collapse. There's nothing.
Yeah. The grog gives it the grit to hold up and stand up a little bit better. You say you're using molds like formers, like push the slabs on them and make the.
Yeah, so I have a lot of dowel part molds that I'll make certain accent pots with the dowel parts.
I gotta go find those.
The first time I met Nick when I was in the garden, he had these dowel heads on the top of all the posts on his garden fence. And I've always been into toys, collecting action figures, all that. When I first walked into his property, I was just like, oh my God. Like he had such cool, like more avant-garde containers for his trees. And the amount of just dowel parts and dowel molds that were around his garden, I was just like, oh, this is amazing. Like right up my alley, And I remember I found at a tag sale maybe 15, 20 years ago, a bunch of dowel molds that I bought them not even really knowing what they were for. And I just pressed the clay. They're old slip molds. And I just press the clay in and carve a hole somewhere to make it.
I was looking at the ones on your Instagram, the bunnies. Where you press them in.
The bunnies.
Maybe they're not bunnies. They look kind of like bunnies.
They could be. I don't think they're. I think there is a
robots.
Oh, those, yeah. So those are kid bunnies that I made the mold. The mold is a little bit failed at this point because it's hard to carve them out. But the toys actually, like the interior packing to the box was like a plastic mold. So I just poured plaster of Paris into those containers to make 2 molds. Yeah, I haven't fired because they're not.
They're solid.
Yeah, they're hard to make hollow.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. That's cool. Maybe there's a future in slip casting for you. Maybe one day you'll get into that. You could slip cast porcelain and wood fire it, I'm pretty sure, as long as you get a cone 10 slip casting clay. That could be something cool one day in the future.
Yeah. What
kind of stuff were you thinking about getting into in the future for your ceramics?
I really like making the bonsai pots. The whole idea that I can make my own pots for my own trees, it is exciting and practical. I like making the orbs. I've made a handful of, like useful wares for my house, whether it's a berry bowl or noodle bowls or teacups, etc. It's fun to make stuff like that. I made a moon jar. It's really misshapen. I won't fire that until November or so, but
that'll be cool.
It was fun to make.
That'll be sweet. Yeah, we all. I like to make I like to make cups and mugs and stuff too. It's pretty fun, and the bonsai pots and basically just bonsai pots, cups, mugs, and then also I really like to make jars. But I throw on an electric wheel, so that's the base of most of my work.
Right. Yeah, cool. I've always been interested. Watching some of the stuff come out of the wood-fired kilns, especially with the lids, it seems at least very hit or miss whether or not the lid's actually going to fit well. But I think it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think that's another just knack that.
That sounds challenging. That sounds really challenging because with jars, yeah, the lid would warp and you can't fire them together. Because sometimes I'll just leave the touching parts of the lid unglazed and fire my lid on my jar. And that way they don't stick. But in a wood fire with the ash, everything would fuse shut.
But all you would do is wad the lid around the lid of
Okay.
the jar.
What's wadding?
Wadding is again, so I don't know exactly what it is, of course, but you know, 5 or 6 components mixed together that have a high calcium content, I believe. It doesn't fuse to the surfaces. So it's what you put
Okay, something to
underneath,
keep it.
right? So it's what you put underneath the pot, so it doesn't fuse to the floor or any of the shelves. I've seen videos where they'll just use the actual calcium powder mixed with nothing else. Ours almost turns into a clay where you'll make little discs, glue them to the bottom of whatever you've made, just from sticking to the floor because of all that atmospheric ash. Use it to whatever it's on. So you put between 4, 5, 6, 8, depending on the size of the bottom of the pot, to keep it from fusing. Sometimes they still do fuse, just depending on how much atmospheric vapor there is, because you'll see that material will get coated in wood ash, and you'll just have to.
That's such a process. Such a process. So, what do you make trees for your pots? So are you setting out with a specific intention, like you've got a certain tree and it needs a certain kind of pot, or are you just making pots and then they just happen to fit trees, like in a more?
It's a little bit of both. So I remember years ago, Nick Lenz told me like his whole process was he was didn't want to buy pots anymore. It was really expensive, and he wanted to make his own pots for his own trees. And it does get super expensive when you get out there and start buying pots with no intention in mind for a tree, or you buy a pot and you're like, okay, I have this idea of what tree I'm going to put in it, and then it ultimately doesn't work because you need a pot that's a half inch bigger or an inch bigger, and you don't either have an opportunity to go get a pot that's only a little bit bigger, right? Or you don't want to spend money on another $200 pot that's a half inch bigger. I remember I remember initially reaching out to a couple potters, this is 15 years ago at this point, for commission work. And I remember a lot of the potters didn't like doing commission work, or they just refused to make any guarantees on size. And now I understand why, where you can make the perfect pot for someone and have it come out with, shrinkage, with even the root mass of the trees is always a problem for me, where I have this idea of where I can put a tree, and the root mass just doesn't work. So you'll put the pot next to the tree and kind of balance it and say, wow, that'll look perfect. But once you get the roots out and you're like, it ultimately just doesn't work out. So for me now, if I can go into my basement or on my back porch and pick through 50 to 100 pots to see what works, it's kind of nice.
Yeah, that's why most people who are into bonsai are also into hoarding bonsai pots.
Yeah, I have a pretty in the basement. I always tell if anything happens to me, you know who to call, because again, it's kind of a trip with the bonsai community, like who's into what, and if you have a certain number of a certain kind of pot, people are just kind of, you know, they'll be knocking on your door.
I don't think they'll be knocking on my door. Not yet, anyways. That's cool, though. There's a lot of great artists out there. I'm hoping to get to talk to a lot of the great ones. If you've got any that you think I should recommend or look out for, try and reach out to, you should let me know. We'll probably just send me an Instagram if you got anyone you want to shout out that I should go ask.
And again, in the States, there's a ton of potters.
There's so many. I love the Australian pottery scene right now. They've got some really, really cool stuff that they're doing as far as what I've seen for textures and how they're making pots that speak to their landscape, their ruggedness, and it's just really cool down there. I find a lot of inspiration from the Australian pottery. Where would you say that you're finding most of your inspiration for your work?
I like the antique Japanese and Chinese Nanban pots initially, like that's the forms. When I was buying a lot of pots from Jim Gremmel, I really liked his clay body. It was very gritty. and he would throw a pot and more or less just put a gouge in it, so that would put that little bit of a dip or a little bit of a wave in the lip. And I thought that was a really interesting way, because you would literally look at the pot and it looked like he just took a trim tool and he would just gouge it at a random spot. So I like that random of that.
That's a cool style. When I end up with a non-bond, it's like I end up at the rim doing something, and I usually end up catching somehow at some point, and then I look at it and I'll be like, "Are you worth it, or are you not worth it?" And sometimes I keep them, but I wouldn't say non-bonds are necessarily my main thing.
A lot of it is the texture. I want it to look good with. I don't have any trees right now, at least, and maybe never, that will be like, you know, in the national exhibition, say. The imperfectness of all my trees, I feel like the pot has to have an imperfection as well. A lot of these pots that you buy are perfect, they're flawless. And if you put an imperfect tree in that flawless pot, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. A lot of my trees are collected trees. A lot of them are larches and pines and junipers. And when they get put into a pot that has a gnarly texture and a huge dip in the rim, it just makes more sense to me that they match, opposed to a perfect rectangle with beautiful cloud feet. And then I'm going to put this imperfect tree in it. They just don't, in my head, they just don't jive.
I love that. I love what you said there about how like the imperfectness of the non-bonds, and I love the imperfection in my throne work, because it's not like the cast work that comes out, that production perfection is no hating on it. It's got its own niche and its thing to do, but like if I make a pot and I fire it and let's say the rim has warped because when I used the cutoff tool maybe I pulled it a little too fast and gave it a little wiggle or something. I look at it and I'm just like, this is just me. Like, it's not perfect. It's not excellent. It is excellent, but it's just something that if you were making them perfectly and making a million that were the same, that little ripple wouldn't be there, or something like that. And it's just a little off. And I also love how you said like you're not trying to get in the nationals, or maybe you will. You don't know. It's hard to say where the pots will go.
Well, it's the expectation. So if you're collecting a tree that has problems, whether it's taper, whether it's branch placement, that tree's never going to be something amazing, or it's going to take 40 years to become amazing, right? So putting it in a pot, I mean, some people might never put that tree in a pot where they can't justify the expense of putting that tree in a $100 or $200 pot. But the pot usually makes at least look a little bit nicer, regardless of its problems. But when the pot has that rugged texture that could possibly accent the bark or the foliage of the tree, and then when that imperfection kind of complements each other, it's beautiful.
I think it's also great to, think if you love the tree, even if it's not conforming to some other standard of what people are saying you should love, I mean, you can still love it and you can still find a cool pot for it. And like I said, that most of the people who probably like my work are a lot of the doing the backyard bonsai for fun people, because my pots don't follow the rules very well all the time, so it's just for fun and a good time. But I love that you have that mentality of setting your expectations for basically the expectation, because if you were trying to achieve a certain goal, it would be very clear what you needed to do to get there, because those rules are written, so to speak. Whereas if you don't have any expectations for the work, you can be more free to express whatever you need to make, because there's no rules necessarily for it to go anywhere, no expectations for it to achieve accolades. It just exists because it needed to.
Yeah, that makes sense. Again, with some of these trees too, they're collected perfect. They weren't grown specifically for bonsai. They're something that you found in the woods or found on a cliff somewhere. So it makes sense to put it in something that just complements that. And a lot of my pots just have that rocky texture, and there's a heaviness to them too, which I always kind of like. A lot of people like super thin. The heaviness keeps them on my benches very safely. The wind doesn't take.
That's very true. When I design pots that I style specifically to be Cascade style pots, I leave a lot of clay at the bottom, because I try to make a pot that's literally weighted so that, like, if you have a tree that's heavier that's hanging out the side of the thing, it's going to stay on your table. It's a bad potter rule, I guess, to leave an inch of clay down here. I'm like, but there's a reason I'm leaving an inch of clay down here, because it's going to weight this pot down.
Yeah, and that's hard because coming home to a tree that's on the ground is so nerve-wracking, disappointing. Stuff that happen. And have you seen those tie-down straps they make? And people will use just fishing string, or they'll use those twisty ties. Um, they don't tend to look that nice, but if you're practical.
Yeah, you do what you gotta do. I think about it a lot because, like, where I have my pottery that's, like, you know, the quote unquote inventory online or whatever, and all my bonsai trees. My bonsai trees all just sit in their pots on shelves that I made outside, like the standard benches, and then all my pottery is stacked in this crazy, like, Jenga Tetris stack on a big shelf. And I just think about the people who live in areas with earthquakes, and I'm like, man, my house would not be okay if I lived in an earthquake area. And the high winds, too. I haven't had wind take a plant off of a shelf or a rack yet, but I have had cats knock things over before. Like, just the feral cats out in the neighborhood.
Yeah, we don't get any hurricanes up this far north, but a couple of years ago, I remember there was a couple what they call like a microburst, which is almost like an isolated tornado. And there was a couple people I knew that it just swept through their backyard, and all their trees were on the ground. You know, every once in a while, some tree container might take a dive, but for the most part, I'm pretty lucky.
I've got pretty good wind protection from just my house, but one time I was at one of those art markets where you got the tent and everything, and, like, I had an insane amount of weight. I had, like, I think like 75 pounds on every leg. I was like overkill because I didn't want the tent police to yell at me that day. I was determined to not get yelled at by the tent police. And the wind came, and this gust grabbed my tent, and it lifted, but it didn't go all the way. It just lifted it. But as it lifted mine, like everybody else who didn't have enough weight, it was like something of legend. Like, tents just went flying across the park, and people's artwork was everywhere. It was horrible. And that's the worst wind I've ever seen here. But we were in a big field, you know, so there wasn't nothing to break it. It just came flying in out of the wherever direction, and ugh, what a day. I'll remember it forever. Have you ever done any of the art shows or anything like that yet?
I did
or your club show?
No club shows, but I did do Mid Atlantic is a bonsai festival every year in New Jersey, right around March, and I had a table there this year, which was exciting to be able to go. I didn't have a lot of inventory, and it was kind of a last minute thing, but it was super fun just to get out there and hang out with everybody. It's a great weekend regardless. I hope to have my own booth, and I have a ton of inventory right now that would vend there, and I'm hoping that'll be the thing. The Nationals is next couple of weeks. That wasn't even an option. It was like all the vendors were already spoken for, and
that one's tough. That's a goal for a lot of people, to get up in there.
Yeah, so that might be 5-10 years down the road. We'll see. Who knows?
That's cool. Would that be a goal for you, to show your pots at Nationals?
Yeah, that would be a good spot. Mid Atlantic's a really good weekend, and there's a ton of people just in the tri-state area that go. And I was very happy with my sales this year. So next year, I think, will be a good gauge for the Nationals, which will be 2 years. You know, after this year, it'll be 2026. So in theory, I would love to be able to vent at the Nationals in 2026.
You can do it. You got this.
Yeah.
I believe in all of you. Everyone I interview, I'm just pumping you all up. I believe in all of you. I am not trying to go to Nationals, so I believe in you guys.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. There's a ton of amazing vendors there here. So just to even be able to go and vend alongside them would be amazing.
Are you going just as a visitor this year to Nationals?
I'm not.
No, I mean neither.
It's about a 6-hour drive for me, which is terrible. But this year, my schedule just doesn't. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, I understand. It's beyond my means to go. People have asked me, and I'm like, no, not unless you're taking me.
How far are you?
I'm in Texas, around the Dallas area, so it's out of the question for me. It's a plane ride for me. I don't think I got a car that could go that far, honestly. Someone had to pick me up. So you sell your work? Do you only sell in person, or do you sell online as well?
Only in person. I haven't set up any kind of commerce. I'll bring pots here and there to the local meetings, like the Hartford meetings. I'll bring pots to when there's a monthly. Besides Mid Atlantic, I really haven't sold much. Well, there's a lot of trading that goes on at the Pottery Studio here and there, but as far as any kind of e-commerce, I haven't set up anything.
Do you think that's something that you're going to look into? No pressure. I understand if you don't want to deal with
So
it.
I have a buddy that's up in New York, Josh Jerem, makes amazing pots, and he sells a lot on like Facebook Marketplace. And he's explained to me his packing process and the amount of material he has to send pots, and I'm just not there yet of wanting to get into that part of it where I'm investing in cardboard packing material, and it's an operation.
Oh yeah, I definitely understand. I mostly sell online and I started in markets and then moved mostly to online because I like selling online, but 25% of my entire business expenses for the whole year is shipping. The materials, the shipping cost. Like I pay more for shipping than for clay and glaze and all of my firing combined.
Wow.
It's all, yeah, shipping is a lot. You just have to account for it. Anyone out there that's listening, you just include it in your pricing. And then I think there's a certain degree of when you're shopping online, because I do free shipping, quote unquote, on everything. But basically, I've just kind of wrapped in what I know I'm paying about to ship anywhere. Thankfully, being in Texas, I'm pretty centrally located, so it's about the same price to ship it almost anywhere in the country for me. So that helps. It's a lot. I definitely understand. I use external shipping. Honestly, I recommend Etsy. I know that they've had they were in big steamy poo, and now they're in recon mode, and it's been better, honestly, Etsy recently, and they take care of a lot as a platform. You don't have to worry about the sales tax or the export import, all that stuff. They take care of a lot, and the market is there without you having to go find it or becoming a social media guru to get it. So I would say that Etsy's a good way to start, unless you are really into being a social media guru and driving traffic to a website.
Yeah, I haven't even got to that point. I was hoping to do a couple festivals a year and just keep it at that at this point. Obviously, I've had a couple people reach out on Instagram that have wanted to buy pots. That's pretty simple. It's you take a picture and next thing you know, someone's asking if it's for sale. But the festivals are nice because the weekend, if you can go there and sell 60, 70 or 100 pots in a weekend, that's pretty amazing and a nice way to just, deplete your inventory.
Yeah, I love that. I love that that's the path that you're going to take. It's good to serve your local community, and you're just chilling, making your chilling pots. And plus, like wood firing, it's this you can't really be on a huge production line with wood fire just because of the time it takes to fire and get everything together.
Well, so the interesting part about that is that we roughly fire once a very, very hectic firing schedule. I haven't had trouble making, but I'm slowing down now where I don't necessarily have a lot to put in every month, but I want to get back to the point where I'm producing more.
What does your production process look like from like start to finish for a series of pots? Like what's the timeline and what's your studio practice like to get you through from like a ball of clay to ready to fire pot?
So I'll roll out 3 or 4 bases and I'll slowly work on coiling them up. Once it's 2 or 3 days in, I'll trim it and then just leave it alone. It'll probably be more or less bone dry within a week or two. I have an area in my basement where I have a pretty large dehumidifier, and I'll move things over there once they're mostly dry. I don't really have any issues with cracking because I'll cover it with plastic for a few days, and then I'll cover it with a cloth for a few days, and then it's a pretty slow drying process, I think, at least.
It sounds like a good process for drying. And when you're working with pots that are around the size that you're working with, it's just fine. I've had issues with cracking, but it's only on pots that are bigger than 12 inches, and I know for sure that it's my drying, and it's a me problem that I'm working on, I promise. But yeah, the drying is always such a thing, especially when you get real big. Are you going to try to make anything real big, or you think you're going to stay around that mid-size, smaller kind of pots?
Yeah, I've made a bunch that are 12 to 14. They're fine. They turn out great. I have a couple orbs that I've made that are 12 to 14 to 16 inches in diameter as well, and they're way too heavy. They're just massive.
I feel that. Door stops.
I made one pot that was 18 or 19, and it survived the bisque, and then it cracked somehow during the transport from the studio down to the kilns. And I didn't get terribly discouraged by that, but I was like, I didn't really have a real reason to make it that big. It just was I'm going to make this giant pot.
Yeah, it's just the journey of the ceramic artist. You're like, gotta make a little pot, and then you just get bigger and bigger until you got 20 pounds on a wheel, and you're like, why am I doing this? And then you go back down to a regular size again.
Exactly. And every pot, when I'm even looking at my back porch right now, I can see a tree pot that I have out there. That thing was going to be, I have no idea what was going to go in it because it was just so large.
Hey, you gotta send it up there to like Ryan Neal over on the Pacific Northwest where they do the massive trees.
Yeah.
Y'all got any massive trees on your side of the coast?
I have a couple 3 or 4 foot pots that were collected. Nothing crazy. Nothing with trunks like he has. All those western junipers are just unbelievable.
They are. They make me jealous. I try not to be jealous, but I am jealous. Everything I have is, down here in Texas, tropicals do pretty good, and anything native and collected that you found that ain't died out in the fields probably all right. It's hard to get anything in from anywhere else though that likes a real winter, because if it ain't from here, it's hard.
Well, that's the other thing that people learn. In the beginning, I had such a variety of trees, and there was a lot of heartache when you lose something that you more or less know that you can't take care of because it's some species that's not native, it's not local, it's coming from a place where the microclimate and the weather is completely different than where you live, and you can't overwinter it properly, and then it dies. So in the beginning, I remember having, probably 15 or 20 different species, and now I'm pretty much down to 3 or 4. Every once in a while, I'll get something kind of rogue that maybe I shouldn't mess with, but they still stay all outside. I bring nothing indoors. Everything just gets put under the benches and gets mulched in, and it just overwinters outside.
I've got a bunch of stuff, you just try things, and I've got a few tropicals that I do baby and bring in the winter. I've got an umbrella Brazilian rain tree that I bring in. That thing is surprisingly done really well for me. And then I've got some natives, but I collected them this past spring in early February, so they still have a long time before they're going to really be anything, but they haven't died, and it was like 110 degrees for 3 straight weeks this summer, and they made it. So we are hoping I think those are going to be good, and hopefully I'll have more collection opportunities with my club to get more more native stuff that's coming up around here. Last time we got a deal with a local park here in Dallas, and they were doing some clearing, and they were like, if y'all want to come in and pick up trash, you can grab some of them little trees while you're out there. We're going to tear them down anyway. And we were like, yeah, we'd love to pick up trash. So we got to get some little natives and some park cleanup.
What are you guys collecting?
I have, they said we could take whatever, anything native or invasive. I have a lot of elms, I think, and I got a privet, I think it's a Chinese privet, and then several different kinds of elms that I'm not exactly sure what they are yet. And one, I think it was mostly just the elms.
Yeah.
And there's another one, but I forgot what it was.
Are they cedar elms? They're called, I believe. Are they elms?
I think it's a Texas elm,
okay,
or something like that. It's mixed in trees. I got some catching up to do on the tree department for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting when I ask a question to someone that the answer is so above it just goes above and beyond what I actually can even grasp. And I'll ask.
I feel the same way about trees.
It's pretty interesting. Like I'm asking somebody that's got a decade's worth of experience with ceramics, and they're giving me this answer where I'm like, I already don't know what you're saying.
Yeah, with the trees, it comes down to I'm like, what do you mean? Fertilization and ramification. It's alive. I'm working on it. I'm excited to see how these collected trees turn out, though. They've got some really great looking trunks, and they're way more interesting than anything I'd found up until that point, because I had just gotten a lot of Basically cuttings, kind of nursery stock type of things up until that point.
Yeah, the process of collecting the trees was so much more fun. It's
It really is. I felt like a feral child when they were like, "Here's the woods. Go pick up some trash, and you can get whatever trees you want." And I just like a lot of people in my bonsai club were walking the trails and looking on the sides of the trails, trying to see if they could see stuff within the first 3 feet of the trail. And I was like, "The trees are in the forest!" And I like went rogue and ran off by myself with the shovel straight into the woods, like 50 feet before I started even looking for stuff. I found some really cool stuff on the understory though. The lower stuff that's been down there for maybe like, 5 or 10 years, just kind of waiting for something to fall over, growing all weird.
Yeah, even accent plants. You can find so many things that you can put in an accent pot, just growing in your yard or growing in a park. There's so much stuff.
What kind of stuff do you collect for accent?
Um, I usually let a good portion of my yard just like grow wildflowers, and I'll see what grows at a lower height. So this summer, blue-eyed grass, which I guess is pretty much everywhere, and it's got these tiny little bluish violet flowers. It only grows to 6 to 8 inches in height. So I was like, oh wow, that would look great in a little pot. And I dug up a bunch of it out of the yard, and it's all survived. And then mini hostas are kind of cool. That's something you can find in a nursery for an accent plant. Any kind of moss, any kind of clumps of moss that I can find growing on a side of a road or in a park too. I love just having moss plantings.
I love moss too. I have a hard time with it down here since it gets so hot and dry. It's hard to keep it going for me. But I got a fish tank full of moss, and that helps me scratch my moss itch.
Yeah, aquariums are nice for moss.
And I guess maybe I could like do like a partial aquarium terrarium where it's all mixed up, keep the moss. I've always thought about doing one of those. It's pretty neat. Do you keep other plants other than bonsai trees, or is it just bonsai and the accents and stuff?
I got a bunch of house plants too. I've always been into potted plants, so I've got a
Nice.
full of succulents, miniature bamboos, and there's one that's constantly throwing. It almost throw. You know how like the money plant always has the babies popping off it.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with that? I have this. I believe it's some kind of African violet, but it's constantly throwing off babies, and they're all just getting put in random pots everywhere.
I was trying to think. I think I have it's an aloe of sorts, but it's not like an aloe vera. It's a different kind of aloe that does that all the time. And I have so many little babies. I'm like, stop making these. I'm about to put them in orders. Like you get a bonsai pot, and you're like, what is this, an aloe? I just give people cuttings, but I don't know the rules for shipping out plants and stuff. So that's what's kind of stopped me from including the little propagations in my orders sometimes.
Yeah, I don't think unless someone rats you out, you're going to be fine. But yeah, it's almost like we have the Japanese knotweed growing everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
and it's super evasive, and they're spraying it with all sorts of herbicides. You know, it's terrible that it's evasive, but I don't know what's worse, spraying it and trying to get rid of it, or just letting it run wild.
Yeah, I can see the duality and the dynamic there. It's a hard choice, like a rock in a hard place. My neighbor has a mimosa, and it's very invasive, and it throws volunteers in my yard every spring, and it's a neat little tree because it grows real fast, although it's not very long lived, so they're not ideal bonsai for that reason. But I like them because I can grab them out of the yard and then wire them up and play with them and just see what they can do for just to mess with them, since they're invasive volunteers basically with a fast growth rate.
Yeah, some of the trees I've had over the years where I've experimented and they've become cool trees. When you know that the winter might be a problem or just their lifespan in general. So like even like birches are always going to die on you. For
Mm-hmm.
me, privets too. I have over the years had a handful of really privets. They seem to be temperamental, being overwintered, and same with the barberries. I've had some barberries that were unbelievable little trees, and somehow they'll either dry out on me or maybe get some kind of a fungus. So I've kind of slowly started to stay away from those species where like a larch or a juniper or pine. I know what pests come each year and when they come. Like with the pines, there's certain caterpillar larvae that just decimate the pine needles. but they only come at a certain time of year. I have it written down somewhere, and you can just kind of hose right off the tree. So it's nice to know those trees aren't necessarily going to die. They can live for hundreds of years if you're lucky.
Gosh, that's such a nuance. So many little things to learn, when you learn what the season of your bugs. I was just thinking that the other day when I was listening to, as we were on our morning walk. I was like, the season of the cicadas is ending, and the season of grasshoppers and crickets is beginning. It's our transition down here from summer to fall. It's not overwintering down here that's the issue. I think I have to worry about things over summering. I'm like, well, it survived August, so I guess it's gonna stay. Like I'm never really worried about winter up down here because it might freeze for a few days, but overall it's pretty easy. It's the summer. It's that whole like over 110 for 3 weeks. It really puts a test on everything that is alive down here.
Yeah, it's terrible. I have a network of friends and family that if I happen to go away for a day or two, and I can at least call them to come water my trees. It's a little bit nauseating though, because sometimes they're like, "Do you really need me to go over there?" And I'm like, "Well, dude, it's going to be like 98 degrees for like 3 days, and I'm not home." Yeah,
It's very important.
but it also puts a damp. It's almost like having a pet that you leave your house because of the pet.
Yeah, we have 3 dogs, and it's definitely like that. Anytime anyone's like trying to get me to go anywhere like that, for example, like nationals this year, I'm just like, man, I got pots drying, trees that need to be watered. In September, it's still gonna be 100 degrees outside. I'm gonna have to go out there and water twice a day, and then like, who's gonna watch my dogs? One of them's crazy. So like, it's just hard to get anywhere sometimes, but I love my life. It's a really great, it's all good things, but it does, some people just don't travel as much.
Yeah, and again, there's days where I stay home. I know I have to water twice, and I wish I didn't have to.
I love that. Like calls into work, hey, I'm not coming in today because it says it's gonna be 98 degrees and my trees have to be watered twice, and I'm gonna have to be here for that. So yeah.
Yeah, or I take an extra long break for lunch to kind of sneak home, water my trees. Yeah.
Hey, it's your lunch. You can go wherever you want for it. Just running home, watering the trees. I love it. I love the commitment. That's what people mean when they say it's a lifestyle. I'm like, these trees have gotta be watered. They gotta. I gotta at least look at them twice a day. I gotta give the soil on top an eyeball, and I'm like, is it looking kind of crusty? But once it starts looking a little dry, I water it again. Especially with the heat down here.
Yeah,
watering is hard.
I can't imagine. There are days up here where almost 3 waterings is probably necessary, or I'll just put the trees on the ground for a week just to have them closer to the ground, down up on a hot bed.
Yeah, I could probably do that. I mostly just am like, who can live in these conditions? And then if you make it, you make it, and if you don't, I don't do it again. Thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been excellent. I learned so much about wood firing.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, where can people find your work online if they want to check out the pots you make and see what you're up to?
On my Instagram page, probably the best bet. Like I said,
Alrighty.
commerce as get.
And that's at red_mountain_bonsai on Instagram.
Yes.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by Blue Nose Trading, which is me and all my patrons. You can get early access to unreleased podcast episodes and YouTube videos by becoming a patron of my work at patreon.com/bluenosetrading. You can find all my current available ceramic work on my website, bluenosetrading.com. For social media links and information about today's artist, be sure to check out the show notes. Thank you so much for tuning in this week. Remember that you have great ideas that are worth exploring, drink lots of water, and I will see y'all next time around.